It was just a 1904 wedding photo, until you zoom in on the bride's hand. The photograph arrived at the Boston Historical Society on a humid afternoon in September 2023, tucked inside a worn leather album that smelled of age and forgotten memories. Marcus Reynolds, a 34-year-old archivist specializing in early 20th century African-American history, carefully lifted the image from its protective sleeve. It showed a wedding scene from 1904, a young black couple standing before a simple altar, surrounded by family and friends dressed in their Sunday best. The bride wore a modest white dress with lace sleeves, her expression serene and hopeful. The groom stood tall beside her, pride evident in his posture. Marcus had seen hundreds of photographs like this. Black families in Boston at the turn of the century had fought hard to document their lives, their joy, their milestones, proof that they existed, that they mattered. Despite a world that often tried to erase them, these images were precious, each one a small act of resistance against invisibility. He placed the photo under the magnifying light, beginning his routine examination. The details slowly emerged. The texture of the bride's dress, the wooden pews of what appeared to be a small church, the faces of guests captured mid-smile. Then his attention shifted to the bride's left hand, resting gently against her dress as she held a small bouquet of flowers. Marcus leaned closer. His breath caught. There, just visible beneath the delicate lace of her sleeve, was a small crescent-shaped scar on the inside of her wrist. Distinctive, perhaps half an inch long, the kind of mark that told a story, but it wasn't the scar itself that made his pulse quicken. It was the recognition. 3 months earlier, Marcus had been cataloging out police records from 1903, documenting cases involving the black community in Boston. Among them was a missing person report for a young woman named Clara, last seen near the Harbor District. The report included a detailed physical description, and one feature had been emphasized, a crescent-shaped scar on her left wrist, the result of a childhood accident. He pulled up the digital file on his computer, hands trembling slightly as he compared the images. The wedding photo was dated May 1904. Clara had disappeared in August 1903, 9 months earlier. Marcus sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The scar matched perfectly. The same size, the same location, the same unusual shape. But the woman in the wedding photo was identified in faded handwriting on the back as Grace and Thomas, May 14th, 1904. If this bride was Clara, then who was Grace? And why would a missing woman appear in a wedding photo under a different name, just months after vanishing without a trace? Marcus spent the next 2 days buried in archives, pulling every document he could find related to the 1903 disappearance. The missing person report had been filed by a man named William, who identified himself as Clara's employer. She had worked as a domestic servant in his household in Beacon Hill, one of Boston's wealthiest neighborhoods. According to William's statement, Clara had left the house on the evening of August 12th to visit her sister and never returned. The police investigation had been minimal, a pattern Marcus recognized all too well. In 1903, when a black woman went missing, the authorities rarely invested significant resources. The case file contained only 3 documents: the initial report, a brief interview with Clara's sister, and a closing notation dated September 1903 stating that no leads had been found. The case would remain open, but inactive. Marcus found the sister's interview particularly haunting. Her name was Ruth, and she lived in the South End, Boston's largest black neighborhood at the time. Ruth had told police that Clara never arrived that evening. She described her sister as quiet, hardworking, and cautious, someone who wouldn't simply run away without word. Ruth had seemed desperate in her testimony, insisting something terrible must have happened. But there was something else in Ruth's statement that caught Marcus's attention. When asked if Clara had any problems or concerns, Ruth had hesitated before saying no. The police officer had noted her pause in the margin. Witness appeared reluctant to elaborate. Marcus pulled property records next, searching for William's address. The house on Beacon Hill had been substantial, a 4-story brownstone that still stood today, now converted into luxury condominiums. William himself had been a merchant, well connected in Boston's business circles. His household had employed several servants, all of them black, all of them living in cramped quarters on the top floor. Then Marcus found something that made him sit up straight, a newspaper article from August 1903, just days before Clara's disappearance. The society pages mentioned William hosting a dinner party, and among the guests was a judge known for his harsh rulings against black defendants. Another guest was a police captain who had publicly opposed allowing black families to move into certain neighborhoods. Marcus cross-referenced dates and locations, building a timeline. Clara had disappeared on a Tuesday evening. The dinner party had been the previous Saturday, 4 days between the two events. He turned back to the wedding photograph, studying every detail with fresh eyes. The church appeared modest, likely one of the black churches in the South End or Roxbury. The guests numbered about 20, their faces showing genuine happiness. The groom, Thomas, looked to be in his late 20s, sturdy and kind-faced. And the bride, Grace, or possibly Clara, stood beside him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Marcus noticed something else. While most of the guests looked directly at the camera, the bride's gaze seemed slightly off-center, as if she were watching the door. Marcus knew he needed more information about the wedding itself. He reached out to Dr. Evelyn Hart, a colleague at Boston University who specialized in African American genealogy and church records. If anyone could help him identify the church in the photograph and trace the couple, it would be her. They met at a small cafe near campus, the autumn rain pattering against the windows. Evelyn, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, studied the photograph through her reading glasses. "That's Bethlehem E," she said immediately, pointing to a distinctive detail in the background, a wooden cross with a particular carved pattern. African Methodist Episcopal Church in the South End. It was one of the central institutions for black families in Boston at that time. The building was torn down in the 1950s, but the congregation still exists, merged with another church in Roxbury. Marcus felt a surge of hope. Would they have marriage records from 1904? They should. Black churches were meticulous about documentation. It was one way to prove legitimacy in a system that often denied our humanity. Evelyn's expression grew more serious as Marcus explained his theory about Clara and Grace being the same person. "You think she was running from something?" "I think she was running from someone," Marcus corrected. "The question is, what happened that made her disappear, and how she ended up married under a different name 9 months later." Evelyn made a phone call to the current church leadership, and within an hour they had an appointment to view the historical records. The church's basement archive was a treasure trove of ledgers, photographs, and documents carefully preserved by generations of congregation members who understood the importance of remembering. The marriage record was there, clear and official. Grace Porter married Thomas Wright on May 14, 1904. The ceremony had been performed by Reverend Samuel Johnson. 2 witnesses had signed, a woman named Dorothy and a man named James, both with addresses in the South End. But it was the bride's signature that stopped Marcus cold. The handwriting was shaky, unpracticed, not the smooth script typical of someone who signed their name regularly, and there was a small ink blot where she'd paused before writing Grace, as if she'd hesitated, almost writing something else. "This doesn't look like someone comfortable with that name," Evelyn observed quietly. Marcus photographed everything, then asked, "Is there any way to find living descendants? Someone who might have family stories about Grace and Thomas?" Evelyn smiled. "In the black community, family histories are passed down like precious heirlooms. If their descendants are still in Boston, someone will know the stories. Let me make some calls." Over the next week, Evelyn worked her network of genealogists, church historians, and community elders. Meanwhile, Marcus continued digging into Clara's background. He found her listed in the 1900 census, living with her sister Ruth and working as a laundress. No parents were listed, suggesting they had either died or been separated during the years following slavery. Then he found something that changed everything. A small newspaper article from July 1903, 1 month before Clara disappeared. It was buried in the back pages, easy to miss. A black woman had testified in court against a white businessman accused of fraud. The woman's name wasn't mentioned, but the article noted she had been employed in the businessman's household and had witnessed irregular financial dealings. The businessman's name was William. Marcus's hands trembled as he pulled every court record he could find related to the fraud case. The proceedings had been held in July 1903 at Suffolk County Courthouse. William had been accused of embezzling funds from business partners, using falsified documents to cover his tracks. The case had been built largely on documentation, but there had been one witness who provided crucial testimony about William's practices, a domestic servant who had seen him forge signatures and destroy evidence. The court transcripts didn't name the servant directly, following a common practice of the time when black witnesses testified against white defendants. She was referred to only as the housemaid. But the testimony itself was detailed and damning. She described specific dates, specific actions, even quoted conversations she had overheard. William had been found guilty and fined heavily, though he avoided prison time due to his connections. The case had concluded on August 9, 1903, just 3 days before Clara disappeared. Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place. Clara had testified against her employer, risking everything to tell the truth. And then, days later, she had vanished. He needed to find Ruth, Clara's sister. The 1903 address was still on record, a boarding house in the South End that no longer existed. But Evelyn's genealogical network came through. Ruth had married in 1905, had 3 children, and her descendants still lived in the Boston area. One of them, a great-granddaughter named Patricia, was a retired schoolteacher living in Dorchester. Patricia welcomed Marcus into her home on a cool October afternoon. She was in her 70s, her living room filled with family photographs spanning generations. When Marcus showed her the wedding photo, her eyes widened. "That's my great-great-aunt Grace," she said immediately. "My grandmother told me stories about her. She was married to Thomas Wright, my great-great-uncle." They had 2 children, lived their whole lives in Roxbury. Did your grandmother ever mention anything unusual about Grace? About how she and Thomas met? Patricia's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. Why are you asking? Marcus explained carefully, showing her the missing person report for Clara, pointing out the matching scar. He watched Patricia's face cycle through surprise, confusion, and then something that looked like recognition. My grandmother once told me something, Patricia said slowly. When I was young, maybe 12 or 13, she said that Grace came to their family under difficult circumstances, that she'd been running from danger. She said the church community protected her, helped her start a new life. Patricia paused, her voice dropping. She said Grace's real name was something else, but we were never to speak of it. It was for her protection, even after she died. Clara, Marcus said softly. Patricia nodded slowly. My grandmother never told me the full story. She said some secrets were meant to stay buried, that digging them up would only bring pain. She looked down at the photograph in her hands, but she also said Grace was the bravest woman she'd ever known and that Thomas loved her with everything he had. Marcus leaned forward. Patricia, I think Clara testified against a dangerous man, and when he was convicted, she had to disappear to stay safe. The church community gave her a new identity, a new life. This photograph is proof of her courage. Patricia's eyes glistened. What happened to the man she testified against? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. Marcus's next step was to understand how Clara could have disappeared so completely and reemerged as Grace. In 1903, changing one's identity wasn't as difficult as it would become later. There were no social security numbers, no universal database of citizens, but it still required help, resources, and a network of people willing to keep a secret. He reached out to Dr. James Mitchell, a historian at Northeastern University, who had written extensively about black mutual aid societies in early 20th century Boston. They met at the university library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes documenting the rich organizational life of Boston's black community. And what you're describing, James said after hearing Marcus's theory, fits a pattern we've seen in other cases. Black churches and mutual aid societies often protected community members who were in danger, especially women fleeing abuse or persecution. It was an informal underground railroad of sorts, but instead of fleeing slavery, people were escaping violence, exploitation, or legal persecution. James pulled out several books, showing Marcus documentation of these networks. The African Methodist Episcopal Church was particularly active in this. They had established protocols for helping people relocate, change their names, find work and housing. It was all done quietly, with the understanding that white authorities couldn't be trusted to protect black lives. So Clara could have gone to Bethel AME after she disappeared, Marcus reasoned, and they would have helped her become Grace. Absolutely. And if she was in real danger, if testifying against William had put her life at risk, the community would have closed ranks around her. No one would have told the police where she was, even if they'd bothered to ask seriously. Marcus thought about the wedding photograph again, about the 20 guests who had witnessed Grace and Thomas's marriage. Every one of them would have known the truth, or at least suspected it, and every one of them had kept the secret. He spent the next several days tracing what happened to William after his fraud conviction. The businessman had lost much of his standing in society, his name appearing less frequently in society pages and business announcements, but he hadn't disappeared entirely. He'd continued operating, though on a smaller scale, until his death in 1919. Then Marcus found something chilling. Another missing person case from 1904, filed in February, just 3 months before Clara and Thomas's wedding. A young black woman who had worked in a different household had vanished. No connection to William was noted in the report, but Marcus checked property records and found that the woman's employer had been a business associate of William's. The pattern was becoming clear, and it made Marcus's stomach turn. Clara's testimony hadn't just exposed William's fraud. It had embarrassed him publicly, damaged his reputation, cost him money. And in 1903, Boston, a black woman making a white man look foolish in court, wasn't just brave, it was dangerous. Marcus returned to Patricia's house, this time bringing copies of everything he'd found. They sat at her kitchen table, the autumn sunlight streaming through lace curtains as he laid out the timeline. Your great-great-aunt didn't just disappear, Marcus explained gently. She was hidden. The church community saved her life by giving her a new identity. And Thomas, he pointed to the groom in the photograph, married her knowing the truth, choosing to protect her. Patricia wiped her eyes. Do you think William was looking for her? I think he would have if he'd known where to look. But the community made sure he couldn't find her. Marcus knew he needed to understand Thomas Wright, the man who had married Clara Grace and kept her secret for the rest of their lives together. Through Patricia and church records, he began piecing together Thomas's background. Thomas had been born in 1876 in South Carolina, the son of formerly enslaved people. He'd migrated to Boston in 1898, part of the Great Migration that saw thousands of black Southerners seeking better opportunities in northern cities. In Boston, Thomas had found work as a carpenter, a skilled trade that allowed him to earn a decent living and gain respect within the black community. By 1904, Thomas was 28 years old, established in his trade, and active in Bethel AME Church. According to church records, he served as a deacon and helped maintain the building, using his carpentry skills for repairs and improvements. Patricia shared what her grandmother had told her about Thomas. She said he was a quiet man, thoughtful and kind. He didn't talk much, but when he spoke, people listened. And she said he loved Grace absolutely, that he would have done anything to protect her. Marcus found Thomas's name in city directories from 1904 onwards, listing him as a carpenter with an address in Roxbury, a neighborhood where many black families had settled. The couple had 2 children, a daughter born in 1905 and a son born in 1907. Both children had grown up in Boston, married, had families of their own. But how had Thomas and Clara met? Marcus searched through church records and found a clue. In early 1904, Thomas had been part of a church committee that helped new community members find housing and employment. It was exactly the kind of role someone would have if they were part of the protection network. Marcus reached out to more of Patricia's relatives, eventually connecting with Robert, Patricia's cousin, and a great-great-grandson of Thomas and Grace. Robert, a retired postal worker in his late 60s, invited Marcus to his home in Hyde Park. "My father told me something once," Robert said, after Marcus explained his research. He said his grandfather Thomas, my great-grandfather, once told him that the most important thing a man could do was stand beside someone who needed protection, even when it cost him something. "Did he say what it cost?" Marcus asked. Robert nodded slowly. "Thomas had been courting another woman before he met Grace. My father said the relationship ended because Thomas chose to marry Grace instead. There were whispers in the community, questions about why he'd married her so quickly, why no one knew much about her family or background. But he married her anyway." "He married her anyway," Robert confirmed. "And from what my father said, they were happy together, really happy. Grace was quiet, kept to herself mostly, but she was devoted to their children and to Thomas. And Thomas treated her like she was precious, like he'd been given something valuable to protect." Marcus felt the story crystallizing. Thomas hadn't just married a woman in need of protection. He'd fallen in love with her, chosen her, built a life with her, knowing that her past could never be fully spoken about. "Did Grace ever talk about her life before the marriage?" Marcus asked. "And not according to my father. She focused on the present, on their family, on building their life together. But my father said that sometimes, especially in her later years, she would get a distant look in her eyes, like she was remembering something from long ago, and Thomas would take her hand and she'd come back to the present." Marcus continued researching William's activities after the fraud trial, and what he found suggested that Clara's fear had been well-founded. In September 1903, just 1 month after Clara's disappearance, a fire had destroyed the boarding house where Ruth lived, the same address Clara had supposedly been visiting the night she vanished. The fire had been ruled accidental, blamed on a faulty lamp. But the timing troubled Marcus. He found newspaper accounts describing how residents had barely escaped, how Ruth and her neighbors had lost everything. There was no mention of anyone being injured, but the message was clear. People close to Clara weren't safe. Ruth had moved shortly after the fire, leaving the South End for Roxbury. Marcus traced her movements through city directories and found that she'd settled on the same street where Thomas and Grace would live just a year later. The proximity wasn't coincidental. The sisters had stayed close, with Ruth helping to maintain Grace's secret while remaining part of her life. Marcus found Ruth's obituary from 1947. She'd lived to be 73, outlived her husband, and had been described as a pillar of the community, and devoted to her church and family. There was no mention of a sister named Clara, but Grace was listed among the mourners, along with devoted nieces and nephews. The more Marcus investigated, the clearer it became that Grace had lived her entire married life under the weight of her secret. She'd raised her children, attended church, participated in community life, all while knowing that her true identity could never be revealed. He found photographs from later years, Grace and Thomas at their daughter's wedding in 1926, both looking older but still close, Thomas's hand resting protectively on Grace's shoulder. Grace at age 60 in 1935, surrounded by grandchildren, her expression peaceful but guarded. Thomas's obituary from 1942, describing him as beloved husband of Grace and noting his decades of service to the church and community. Grace had lived until 1952, dying at 77. Her obituary was brief but warm, noting her devotion to her family and church. There was no mention of where she'd been born, no reference to parents or early life. The obituary began with her marriage to Thomas in 1904, as if her life had started then. In a way, Marcus realized it had. Clara had died in 1903, erased by necessity. Grace had been born to take her place, to live safely, to love and be loved without fear. But Marcus found one more document that brought the danger into sharp relief. A letter from 1908, preserved in church archives, written by Reverend Samuel Johnson, the same Reverend who had married Thomas and Grace. In the letter, addressed to another AME minister in New York, Reverend Johnson discussed the church's responsibility to protect vulnerable community members. He wrote, "We have in our congregation several souls who came to us fleeing persecution and danger. They have built new lives here, taken new names, and found safety in our fellowship. But we must remain vigilant. There are those who would harm our people if given the chance, and our sacred duty is to ensure that chance never comes." The letter was dated August 1908, 5 years after Clara's disappearance, 4 years after her marriage to Thomas. The community had been protecting her for years, and they'd remained watchful, understanding that the danger might never fully pass. Marcus had been working on the case for nearly 2 months when he received an unexpected email. It was from a woman named Helen, who identified herself as William's great-great-granddaughter. She'd heard through genealogical circles that someone was researching her ancestor's fraud conviction and wanted to speak with him. They met at a neutral location, a library reading room in Cambridge. Helen was in her early 50s, a lawyer, and she carried herself with cautious professionalism. She'd brought a leather folder containing family documents. "I want to be clear about something," Helen said as they sat down. "My great-great-grandfather was not a good man. My family has known this for generations. The fraud conviction was only the beginning. There were other allegations, other problems that the family tried to cover up or ignore." Marcus listened carefully as Helen opened her folder. Inside were letters, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes spanning decades. After the conviction, William became obsessed with the woman who testified against him. Helen explained, her voice tight. "Family letters mention it. He felt she'd humiliated him, destroyed his reputation. He spent months trying to find her, but she'd vanished completely." "Did he ever find her?" Marcus asked, though he was almost certain he knew the answer. "No, and it drove him nearly mad. He became paranoid, convinced that the black community was hiding her deliberately, mocking him." Helen pulled out a letter dated 1904. "This is from William's brother, trying to convince him to let it go, to move on. But William wouldn't. He hired private investigators, threatened people, tried everything he could think of." Marcus felt cold. "He was looking for Clara." Helen looked up sharply. "You know her name?" "Clara testified in the fraud case. She disappeared 3 days after the verdict. I believe your great-great-grandfather was trying to find her to punish her." Helen's expression hardened. "That would be consistent with everything else I know about him." She pulled out another document. "This is from 1905, a police report. William was arrested for threatening a black minister who refused to answer questions about members of his congregation. The charges were dropped. William still had enough influence for that. But it's clear what he was doing." "He was trying to find information about Clara," Marcus said. "The minister's name was Samuel Johnson," Helen confirmed, "the same reverend who had married Thomas and Grace." Marcus's chest tightened. The community hadn't just been protecting Clara abstractly. They'd been actively defending her against a specific, persistent threat. Helen continued, "William died in 1919, still bitter, still searching. Family stories say he never recovered from what he called the humiliation of that trial. He blamed one woman for all his failures, when really he'd done it all to himself." "I need to tell you something," Marcus said. He explained about the wedding photograph, about Grace, about the scar that connected her to Clara. He watched Helen's expression shift from surprise to understanding to something like relief. "She got away," Helen whispered. "She survived him. She did more than survive. She built a life, had a family, lived to be 77 years old." Helen closed her folder, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm glad. My family has carried shame about William for 4 generations. Knowing that the woman he tried to hurt actually escaped, actually found happiness, it doesn't undo what he did, but it's something." With Helen's information, Marcus could finally piece together the complete timeline. Clara had worked in William's household for at least 3 years before the fraud case, quietly observing his illegal activities. When investigators had needed a witness, Clara had stepped forward, knowing the risk, but choosing truth over safety. Her testimony in July 1903 had been devastating to William's defense. She'd described specific conversations, produced documents she'd quietly preserved, demonstrated William's pattern of deception. The verdict had come on August 9th, guilty on multiple counts. 3 days later, on August 12th, Clara had left the Beacon Hill house, supposedly to visit Ruth, but Marcus now believed she'd gone directly to Bethel AME Church, where Reverend Johnson and the Protection Network had been waiting. The fire at Ruth's boarding house in September had been William's retaliation, a message that he was looking for Clara and would hurt anyone close to her. For 8 months, Clara had remained hidden, sheltered by different families within the church community, never staying anywhere long enough to be traced. The community had given her a new name, Grace Porter, and created a plausible background story. She'd been introduced to Thomas, probably through Reverend Johnson, as a woman who needed protection and a fresh start. The marriage in May 1904 had been both practical and genuine. It had given Clara permanent protection. A married woman with a respectable husband was harder to trace and threaten than a single woman living alone. But the wedding photograph and family testimony suggested real affection between Thomas and Grace. He'd known her story, chosen to protect her, and built a life with her that lasted nearly 40 years. Patricia and Robert provided Marcus with additional photographs from the family collection. Grace, at 30, holding her infant daughter, her expression finally relaxed. Grace and Thomas on their 25th anniversary in 1929, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Thomas's hand still protective on her shoulder. Grace in her 70s, a grandmother many times over, smiling at the camera with genuine warmth. "She looks peaceful in these later photos," Marcus observed to Patricia. "My grandmother said Grace became more herself as the years passed," Patricia replied. "Like she finally believed she was safe, that she could breathe without fear. Thomas gave her that. The community gave her that." Hontans, Marcus found one final piece of evidence in church records. A note from 1920, written by Reverend Johnson before his retirement, to his successor. It was a private memorandum about members who had special circumstances requiring continued discretion. "Sister Grace Wright," the note read, "came to us in distress 17 years ago. She has been under our protection since, living as an honored member of our congregation. Her husband, Brother Thomas Wright, has been her steadfast protector. Though the original danger may have passed with the death of the one who sought her, her true identity remains known only to a few. We ask that this confidence be maintained for her peace of mind and dignity." William had died in 1919. Even after his death, the community continued protecting Grace's secret, understanding that dignity and peace were worth preserving. Marcus prepared his findings for presentation to the Boston Historical Society. But first, he met with Patricia, Robert, and several other descendants of Thomas and Grace. They gathered in Patricia's living room, 3 generations of family members, to hear the full story their ancestor had lived. Marcus laid out the evidence chronologically: Clara's work in William's household, her brave testimony, her disappearance, the fire at Ruth's boarding house, the protection network that saved her, the wedding photograph with its telling scar, and the long, peaceful life she'd built as Grace. The room was silent when he finished. Then Robert spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "My great-grandfather was a hero. He protected her when no one else could." "Your entire community were heroes," Marcus corrected gently. "Reverend Johnson, Ruth, the church members who sheltered Clara, the people who kept her secret for decades, they all participated in saving her life." Patricia touched the wedding photograph, her finger tracing Grace's face. "She was brave too, to testify, knowing what it would cost, to build a new life from nothing, to trust Thomas and the community to keep her safe." Over the following weeks, Marcus wrote a detailed article documenting Clara, Grace's story for the Historical Society's journal. He worked closely with the family, ensuring they were comfortable with how their ancestor's story was told. They decided together that while Clara's courage deserved recognition, some details would remain private, respecting the dignity she'd fought so hard to maintain. The article was published in January 2024, accompanied by the wedding photograph and several images of Grace's later life. It told the story of a black woman who'd stood up to power, paid the price, and been saved by her community's love and solidarity. It highlighted the protection networks that black churches and mutual aid societies had created, the quiet heroism of people like Thomas, who had opened their lives to shelter someone in danger. Local media picked up the story. Grace's descendants were interviewed, sharing family memories and photographs. The current congregation of the church that had absorbed Bethel AME held a special service honoring Grace's memory and the tradition of protection their ancestors had maintained. Helen, William's descendant, attended the service. She stood at the back, tears streaming down her face, and afterward approached Patricia. "Thank you," Helen said quietly, "for letting her story be told, for showing what real courage looks like. My ancestor tried to destroy her, but your ancestor survived and thrived. That matters." Patricia embraced her, and in that moment a historical wrong found a measure of peace. Marcus stood in the church, looking at a memorial display the congregation had created. The wedding photograph was there, enlarged and restored, showing Grace and Thomas frozen in that moment of hopeful beginning. Beside it were later photos showing Grace's life, as a mother, grandmother, community member, beloved wife. The crescent-shaped scar that had started his investigation was barely visible in the wedding photo. Hidden beneath lace, a small mark carrying an enormous story. But now that story was known, honored, preserved for future generations. Grace had lived 57 years under her chosen name, 48 of them as Thomas's wife. She'd raised children who became parents and grandparents. She'd attended church, laughed with friends, grown old in safety. Clara's courage in that courtroom in 1903 had cost her one life, but the community's protection had given her another, fuller, longer, filled with love. As Marcus left the church that evening, he thought about all the old photographs still waiting in archives and albums, each one potentially holding stories like Grace's. Stories of courage, sacrifice, community, and love. Stories that deserved to be found, understood, and remembered. The wedding photograph had seemed ordinary at first glance, just another young couple beginning their lives together. But when you zoomed in, when you looked closely at the bride's hand, you found a scar that told a story of testimony, danger, disappearance, protection, and ultimately, survival. Grace's story was now part of history, her courage finally recognized, and the community that had saved her, Reverend Johnson, Ruth, Thomas, and countless others who'd kept her secret, were honored as the heroes they'd always been.